From my window, I could watch the boulevard, and the sight was a curious one. Sometimes groups of volunteers marched past. The volunteers consisting of young enthusiasts and old supporters of the royal cause, the former arrogant and proud, the latter already dragging along under the weight of the equipment. Both were equally inexperienced, both equally full of ardor, and both shouting, "Long live the king!" They would be followed by a cavalry regiment of the old army, whose horsemen sat motionless amid the turmoil, unmoved by the demonstrations in which the crowd sought to make them share. They seemed to disdain these empty cheers, preoccupied by the thought of the man against whom they were about to fight, rather than by that of the one whose cause they were to defend. Meanwhile, the crowd, as if it were at a play, waited eagerly for the outcome of all these events, but was well aware it would shortly be acclaiming whichever of the two adversaries was victorious. It happened that the apartment next to mine was occupied by one of the heads of the Chouans, the royalists. All day, unprepossessing-looking men came to see him and seemed to be receiving money and taking orders. An old woman who was in her room heard what they said and assured Madame Lefebvre that they were all connected with the police spy service and that she had heard money and weapons being distributed. This, of course, increased Madame Lefebvre's fears for my safety. She begged me not to show myself at the window because opposite there lived a painter who held extremely royalist ideas, and upstairs was the family of a member of the king's bodyguard. Certain anonymous letters sent me to my home announced that 200 Chouans were going to meet the emperor disguised as deserting troops and that they were planning to murder him. I trembled, but how was I to warn him? Monsieur Devout came one evening to give me news of what was happening to my friends. All those who were known to be Bonapartists had already gone into hiding. The Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt had sought refuge with an old cook, Monsieur de Flahaut at the house of Monsieur Alexandre de Girardin, and Monsieur Lavalette in my house. Surprised at the spot the latter had chosen as a hiding place, I was told that it had seemed a particularly safe spot since I had left it. Moreover, he was taking all sorts of precautionary measures, such as arranging a secret cupboard in the attic and wearing the wig of my steward by way of disguise. This sometimes resulted in rather amusing scenes, which lightened the atmosphere of my home while I was away. The Duc de Trente Fouché, who was arrested, as he had expected, found an excuse to slip away from the police officers when they had already taken him into custody. By means of a ladder, he climbed the wall into my garden. Having, in his nervousness, forgotten the key of the little gate, he broke the lock with a stone and left the door open. The police were so surprised not to find any trace of him in his own house, in spite of their search, that it was rumored there were secret passages between it and mine. The Duc de Trente Fouché has since told me that the night before he had come to ask me to facilitate his escape and talk about my brother, he had had a long talk with the Comte d'Artois. The latter had begged him on behalf of the king to assume the post of chief of police with unlimited powers, but the Duke refused, saying it was too late, that it was no longer possible to save their dynasty. This refusal was doubtless, as he suspected, the reason for his arrest. I wrote to Madame Duquesne to find out what happened to Monsieur Sosthenes de la Rochefoucauld, who was liable to expose himself unduly on account of his great admiration for the royalist cause. He was at Bordeaux with the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who displayed a strength of character worthy of her rank. One evening, I was told that a mail carrier, the father-in-law of Vincent Rousseau, my valet de chambre, had just arrived from Lyon, where he had witnessed the emperor's entry into the city. An immense throng, intoxicated with the joy of again catching sight of him, had cheered him loudly. King Louis XVIII sent for this messenger and inquired if he had seen Bonaparte. The messenger replied quite frankly that he had seen him at Lyon, surrounded by a crowd of people who kissed his uniform and whose enthusiasm was boundless. He added, "I must say, sire, that your nobility were far from brave. I saw your brother come back with 2 gendarmes. Everybody else had abandoned him. The courtiers hastened to silence him, while the king, quite overcome, hid his face in his hands. The messenger having been dismissed, the chief of police sent for him and forbade him to tell what he had seen at Lyon, or even to leave his home. But the messenger told everything to his daughter, who came to impart it to her husband. Monsieur Lavalette forbade Vincent Rousseau to go to see his father-in-law, fearing that he and my other servants might be suspected if it was discovered they were in touch with a government dispatch bearer. During the few days I had spent in the house, things began to seem very tedious to me, and in spite of my old servant's warnings, I could not resist standing by the window to breathe a little fresh air. On the morning of March 20th, I caught sight of the youthful members of the king's bodyguard, who had looked so fiery a short time before, looking downcast as they bade sad farewells to the members of their grief-stricken family. The painter who lived across the street appeared at his window with a very preoccupied air. The huge white ribbons, white being the color of the Bourbons, with which he adorned his buttonhole had disappeared. Armed with a feather duster, he was busy removing the dust from the life-size portrait of one of the emperor's ministers. I thought I recognized the likeness as that of Monsieur de Montalivet. The painter's wife, thin and nervous, appeared to be arguing with him vigorously in a state of great excitement. All these changes made me feel that still others had occurred elsewhere in the capital. I was impatient to hear the news when Monsieur Devoe arrived and told me that the king had left hastily during the night upon hearing that Marshal Ney and his army corps had gone over to the emperor. Monsieur Devoe had heard of this departure from one of the men who cleaned the floors of his house. This man was the uncle of a dancer at the opera named Virginie, the mistress of the Duc de Berry. During the night of March 19th, the prince had come to say goodbye because the young dancer had just had a child. He told her in the presence of her family, whom he urged to take good care of her, "We must separate forever. We have lost everything. No hope remains." I wished to return home immediately, but Monsieur Devoe pointed out that hordes of people without any clearly defined means of livelihood were pouring into Paris and might the more easily commit excesses of all kinds, since the Bourbons had left the capital without any commander or anyone in authority to keep order. Does it seem possible, in spite of the various emotions which had preyed upon me during the last few days, I was still sentimental enough to care about what became of this family, who were thus, after a brief return home, once more driven into exile? They must be suffering all those painful sensations which I had a short time before experienced myself, and this idea caused me to feel a sincere sympathy for them. The Orleans family were those for whom I felt the most sorry. Without knowing any of them personally, their affable behavior, their highly respectable domestic life had charmed those who had come in contact with them, and the sentiment had communicated itself to me. I recalled that the Duke had received my brother kindly, and in this critical moment, when it was possible that the masses might commit some act of violence against them, I, who had nothing to fear from the mob, would have been glad to be useful to them if the opportunity had presented itself. A few days before, prompted by this feeling, I had sent word to one of my maids who had also been employed by Mademoiselle d'Orléans, the sister of Louis Philippe, placing my services at their disposal. Should they feel that either they themselves or any of their children were in danger, I urged them to trust me implicitly. My maid, Madame Charles, went to deliver my message and came back saying that she had not ventured to do so. Alas, she added, how could I utter your name when Mademoiselle d'Orléans, on catching sight of me, exclaimed, "We are obliged to leave again, and it is that Duchess de Saint-Loup who has caused our ruin." In a moment that was such a critical one for the king, I remembered only the friendly manner in which he had received me, and I thought that at a time when everyone was deserting him, it would be agreeable to him to hear that I still recalled his kindness toward me. I wrote him and repeated the expression of my thanks, giving the letter to Monsieur de Lescourt, an officer of his bodyguard who was to join him abroad. Monsieur Devoe came back at 3 o'clock and said that in all probability the emperor would enter Paris that same day. He had with him a letter which the Duc de Trente-Fouché wished me to forward to the emperor, it being important, so he said, that the emperor receive it before entering the city. I believe it was to warn the emperor to be on his guard against the Chouans. in disguise who were planning to assassinate him. My valet de chambre Rousseau left at once with it. Nothing surprised me so much on my way home as to see along the boulevards how all the shopkeepers were busy changing or turning around their signs. The eagles and the bees were taking the place of the lilies, and fortunately this change was the only indication of the great events that had taken place. Perhaps the most amazing, miraculous, and unheard of thing of all was the Emperor's march from Caen to Paris. When he came up to the outpost of the 1st Regiment, which had been dispatched from Grenoble to attack him, the Emperor dismounted, stepped forward alone, and said to the nearest soldier, "Do you recognize me? Would you dare fire at your general?" Cries of "Long live the Emperor," with a reply that this body of troops joined his force. A short time later, Colonel de la Bataillere brought over his regiment and opened the gates of Grenoble. From then on, as far as Paris, the Emperor traveled in a little carriage, almost without any escort. As soon as he caught sight of a regiment marching toward him, he would quietly get out, walk forward to meet it, and review it as he'd done in the past. At first, they were astonished. Then they became enthusiastic and gave way to their emotion until it seemed to him and to other observers that he had never ceased to be the Emperor of the French. My valet de chambre met the Emperor near Essonne, just as he was changing horses, and found the escort so small that he could not realize that this was he. Having delivered the letter, he returned to report that so many country folk were hurrying up from all sides to see the Emperor pass, and so many Parisians were going out to meet him, that he had been obliged to come back at a snail's pace. Everywhere, the enthusiasm was intense. The troops who had concentrated at the camp at Milan and who had taken their places along the Essonne road shouted, "Long live the Emperor!" As soon as they caught sight of him, and certain generals who till then had been rather undecided allowed themselves to be carried away by the impetus of the crowd in spite of the opinions they had held the day before. They have since declared, "The princes were not there. What could we do?" The Emperor's former aides-de-camp, as well as the Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt, had left in the morning of March 20th to meet him and had joined him at Essonne. He embraced them all and had the Duc de Vicence Caulaincourt step into his carriage, where there already were General Drouot and General Bertrand. An officer of the National Guard came at 7 o'clock in the evening to invite me to go to the Tuileries to await the arrival of the Emperor. The officer was sent by the former cabinet ministers. Crowds surrounded the palace. The sight of my carriage caused much cheering. The sentries belonging to the National Guard were turned out, and they saluted as I arrived. They cheered so loudly that I thought it must be the Emperor who was approaching. When I discovered that the demonstration was in my honor, I could not help smiling, for I remembered that a few days before I had passed the same spot quite unrecognized by the men on duty. How quickly things change. I found many officers and ladies assembled in the apartments of the former cabinet ministers. Among the ladies were the Duchesse de Bassano, Duchesse de Friaul, Duchesse d'Istrie, Duchesse de Rouvigo, Madame Gazani, and Madame Lalimont. Queen Julie, wife of Napoleon's brother Joseph, King of Spain, who happened to be in Paris seeking to regain possession of her estate at Montfontaine, which had been sequestrated, arrived a moment after I did. The renewed cheering that greeted her made us again imagine that it was the Emperor. Night had fallen. The crowd withdrew. People did not believe he would arrive till the next day. Had he postponed his entry till then, his reception would have been a real triumph, but he never on any occasion made a formal state entry into Paris. He always returned to his palace after dark. It was not till the next morning that his arrival was announced. Perhaps in this particular instance, he wished to return on March 20th, the anniversary of his son's birth. The royalists declared it was fear of the attitude of the Parisians which delayed him, and that he did not arrive till after dark intentionally. Finally, at 9 o'clock, he drove up into the court of the Tuileries, just 20 days after he landed on French soil. He had not encountered the least resistance anywhere, and had only stopped long enough to change horses and review the different troops. His carriage stopped at the entrance to his ordinary apartment. We went to meet him, and for a few moments he was in actual danger. So great was the eagerness with which people pressed forward, seized by an intoxication which is difficult to explain. We could scarcely manage to withdraw from the crowd in order to avoid being suffocated ourselves. As we did so, we saw him caught up by 1,000 arms and carried in triumphantly to his own apartments. When he arrived there were only 2 of his former aides-de-camp besides his carriage. The others reached Paris later. When the first movement of joy and enthusiasm had passed, my friends managed to make a path for me through the crowd, and I was able to enter his drawing room with the other ladies. I stepped forward to embrace him, accompanied by Queen Julie. He received me rather coldly and asked my sister-in-law, "How does it happen that you are here?" I noticed he embraced all the other ladies more warmly than he did us. He greeted all the men in a most cordial manner, especially Prince of Eckmühl, General Davout, with whom Napoleon had won the Battle of Eckmühl in 1809. Madame Lallemant asked for and obtained immediately the release of her husband, who had been sentenced to death on account of having headed a mutiny. The emperor asked her various questions about this incident, which he had heard about only vaguely in the recent newspapers. It was announced that supper was ready, and he went in, passing us without a word. Queen Julie and I were alone in the drawing room, speaking of the cold reception which we had received, when I heard a noise in the emperor's study. I went to see what it was. To my extreme surprise, I discovered there the young accountant Fleury de Chaboulon, who had left a few months before to go to Elba. He told me he had arrived at the Tuileries just after the emperor, to whose cabinet he was attached. It seemed that an illness had prevented his reaching Elba before the end of February. On his arrival, the emperor had asked a great many questions regarding conditions in France, and he was quite sure it was his account that had made the emperor decide to land so quickly, although the emperor had never said a word to this effect. On the contrary, having returned by way of Italy to do certain things for the emperor, he was amazed on arriving at Lyons to find his master there. The latter had allowed him to come to Paris in one of his carriages. Thus, no one in France could have received word of this return, for the only man who went to Elba arrived in France after the emperor did. I asked Monsieur Fleury de Chaboulon if the emperor had spoken about me and what he had said. His reply was that he had scarcely mentioned me, as the emperor had appeared so indignant at my having remained in France that he had not dared deliver my message to him. I returned to the drawing room. The emperor came in a few minutes later and stepped up to me. "Where are your children?" he said. "Sire, existing conditions obliged me to send them away from home. I ask your permission to bring them to you tomorrow." "I see by the papers," he went on, "that you lost your case." "I was sure you would. Everything depends on paternal authority." Then he went into his study, where he received all his ministers one after another. This took so long that we decided to withdraw, although we had not yet made our farewells. The Duc de Visson's Caulaincourt, as we went out, told me he had taken my part, that people had tried to do me much harm at Elba by false reports about me, and that the emperor, greatly annoyed, did not wish to receive me at all. The Duke told me that he himself had done everything he could to modify this attitude. He advised me to come the next day with my children. I did so and arrived very early. An enormous crowd already filled the garden. Officers of all branches of the service and every rank crowded about the courtyards and the stairways. Never had I seen such enthusiasm. People are always willing to applaud anything that arouses their astonishment, but this event had something superhuman about it which stirred even the least interested observer. Such was the prestige which everyone felt obliged to accord the man who had shown himself so far above ordinary beings by his personal character and by his career. My heart beat violently when I entered the emperor's drawing room. He was alone near the open window, returning the acclamations of the people which filled the air. He received me coldly, embraced my children, inquired with interest about their health, and after we walked about for a few minutes without saying anything, while my children watched the crowds that thronged the gardens. Every time we approached the window, the cheers increased. In vain, I sought to remain in the background. I was so conspicuous that next day, the newspapers stated that the emperor had called the crowd's attention to me and my children, an account which was altogether inaccurate, as on the contrary, he still seemed angry with me. Finally, he broke the silence and said, "I would never have thought you would forsake my cause." "Forsake your cause, sire? Would I? Or even could I have done such a thing? You had no right to dispose of the future of my nephews without my permission. Your husband was right to be distressed by such behavior. Sire, you do not know the reason which made me remain in France. My mother wished me to do so. I was all she had left. My husband, as you know, offered me no support. His advice could not inspire me with any confidence. Where was I to go? With your brother. But he had no situation of his own as yet. He had gone to ask for one at Vienna. You could have gone and demanded one also. Do you think I should have been allowed to do so? The Emperor of Russia proved a generous foe. He wished to assure my children's future. Could I possibly have refused him? Did anyone decline the Duchy of Parma, which was offered your son? That was quite different. That ensured his independence. Your son, sire, has lost more than mine. He had lost the throne of France. People considered he was fortunate in securing even so small a compensation as the Duchy of Parma. Should I have refused for my sons, who were only princes, a compensation which doubtless was still less important in itself, but nevertheless was more so in proportion to their position? What does it matter? You had no business to stay in France. A piece of bread by the roadside would have been preferable. Moreover, don't you imagine that your children would have been benefited by these so-called gifts? They would have been got rid of. You behaved like a child yourself. When one has shared a family's rise in rank, one must share its misfortunes. On receiving this reproof, which I so little deserved, but which my having remained in France seemed partly to justify, I could not restrain my tears. Ah, sire, how greatly I've been mistaken. I thought I was doing my duty in keeping your nephews from going into a foreign country. I could not write you. I vainly attempted to do so. I hoped you would be pleased that at any rate they remained on French soil, in the midst of their countrymen. Where were there any friends to whose care I could have confided them? Touched by my grief, the emperor said to me in a milder tone, now then, you have not a single good excuse to make, but you know I'm a good father and shall forgive you willingly. Let us not speak of it any more. Besides, I know how well you behaved while living in France. I wish to go into details regarding my lawsuit, explained that I had been obliged to defend my case, but he said, oh, about that matter, you are a mother. That explains everything. Admiral Verhuell was announced. The emperor advanced to meet him and said with emotion, come here, Admiral, let me embrace you. I am delighted to see a hero again. If everyone had behaved as you did, all those misfortunes would not have taken place. The admiral, deeply moved, could not reply. Both men had tears in their eyes. I was delighted to see such well-deserved praise being given to one of my friends. Monsieur le Comte de Molay was admitted. He came to thank the emperor for his kindness, but requested he only be appointed head of the Department of Roads and Bridges, not feeling qualified to accept the cabinet post the emperor had offered him. When alone with me, the emperor inquired, has Molay changed toward me? I do not think so. He continued to come and see me, although less frequently. The reason I wonder about it, continued the emperor, is that I wish to make him Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he declared the post. Do you mean, sire, that you were not going to appoint the Duc de Vicence, Caulaincourt? Everyone is aware how much he has always done to prevent hostilities, and France needs peace so much. He is too fond of foreigners. But, sire, you must convince foreigners that you wish for peace. His nomination would be a guarantee of your intentions. So that is how it is. You are playing politics nowadays. Saying this, he pinched my ear. He went on to speak of my mother, of her death, and of the grief it had caused him.